Hey everyone, it's the Caveman here. I wanted to go over how to create your own 808 drum sounds. Well, I want to focus on the concepts of what make an 808 an 808, and then we'll briefly touch upon all the processing that you can do or not do to really fine tune the 808 to be what you want to be or what. So to start, we're going to jump in with a sine wave. Now you can really start with any kind of basic waveforms and even some other weirder ones. We'll come back to that. The classic 808 sound has that pure sine wave feel to it. So we're going to start with that and use distortion to get it more aggressive, and then we'll come back and use like a sine wave or a saw wave or a square wave to start with something more buzzy, but again using filters to shape that. So if we listen to what we got so far, we just have a buzzy-ish kind of 808, sine wave, because this is the analog sine wave that Room has. If we go to the basic shapes and we listen to this, notice how it's much more rounder. It's not as buzzy. You can use whichever you prefer. I find you get more interesting results with that buzziness because it has that analog feel to it and not perfect. Gives you some more room to. Now, the basic concept of an 808 is really just a punchy sound that rings out, right? It's almost like, I mean, it comes from the idea, it came from a kick, right? Where it was used as kick in the TRA, the T Roland. And we've kind of, that's evolved into being a bass. So if you want to think of like what happens when you hit a kick drum, right? You have a mallet that smacks it, which creates a higher frequency sound, and then the kick vibrates, which creates the low end. So if we want to try and replicate that, we just want to control our pitch over time. But before we do that, let's get the shape of the volume correct. Now, what happens when you hit a kick, right? You quickly tap it, the mallet hits the kick vibrates for a certain amount of time, and then decays back to zero. So if we want to mimic something like that, we want an almost instant attack, though I'm going to leave it at the default, which is 0.5, so we don't get any clicks. And we're going to bring down the decay and the sustain. The values that you set these at, they don't need to be exact. It's really just to taste. But you generally want a longer release time, maybe around a second or higher. You generally want to have your sustain about halfway or below. And you want to have a decay that I would say for sure. The decay doesn't necessarily matter as much as the other ones, because if you're tapping the note, the decay doesn't really trigger anyways. It usually triggers the attack and then straight to the release. So if we listen to what we have now, we get that. Notice how that we can see the blue ball start here and then instantly jump here. If I held out the note, we'll see it go through the whole motion of. When I let go, then we go through the process of the release. So that's why the decay doesn't necessarily matter unless you're holding out the note. But generally with 808s, you're playing by tapping. One thing you always want to remember to do on your 808s too is set mono on. Now, if you don't have the ability to mono, like you're in a synth that only has the poly section, you just want to set your poly down to 1 so that notes don't overlap each other. But we're going to set this to mono because we want it to trigger every time we hit. Now we have the basics of the absolute basics of this sound, which is just a sound that, a subby sound that releases over time. But to get that punchy sound, we want to think back to the kick and what's happening when you hit the kick, right? You have the mallet hitting the skin. Well, how do we replicate that, right? If we're only using our sound, because you could use layers, of course, but to have our sound have that imprint on it, you basically just want to automate or modulate the pitch over time. Now, depending on what synth you're in, this will change. Some synths have a dedicated pitch modulation section, like operator, where you can turn on, set the amount, set the shape, and you're good to go. Within Serum, we have to set an envelope to trigger or to modulate our pitch over time. We could drag this to anywhere on the actual oscillator, so to the coarse or the semitone. But I'm going to use the matrix and do the overall master tuning. Take envelope 3, and we'll set the destination to. So this is going to modulate the entire patch. So whether we have subs, noise, and oscillator B on, all of them will follow this tuning module, which is useful when you're using more than one oscillator. And we'll set a value of, let's say, 12, so an octave above. When we set this to master tuning, the values become semitones. And we want to make sure that we're in a unipolar, so we're only moving in a positive direction. We're not moving in a negative direction and then a positive direction. So now that we have this, we notice that we haven't built the shape yet. So for this, we want a very plucky feel to it. And the tighter it is, the tighter the pitch down will sound. So the longer it is, you actually have a descending feel. But the quicker it is, because it happens so fast, start to get that kicky sound. Now, you can, again, the amount is really to taste. Because it happens so fast, it doesn't necessarily need to be an octave, because we're not picking it up as a pitch. We're picking up as a very quick movement. So really to taste, the higher you go, the more of a laser sound you get. I find usually somewhere between 2 octaves and 1 octave and 2 octaves is a spot. But I generally go with just an octave. So now that we have the absolute basics of this sound, we can start going into the processing and turning it into something more interesting, more gritty, smoother, rounder. It really depends on what you're looking for. But we'll briefly touch upon a lot of these. Generally, 808s have some form of distortion in them, whether it's light distortion like this, just to give the sound some more roundness, or more, not so much roundness, but aggressiveness. We're trying to give it some character, to all out, super intense, depending on, again, depends on what your production is looking for, or what you're trying to make. Now, one thing we can do is we can use this envelope that's controlling the shape of the volume to also control the distortion. So now you're getting more like a tom sound. You're getting a very bright and very aggressive transient, but then the sound rounds off at the end. And again, this is all really to taste. I just want to talk about the concepts of, distortion. You can also try some weird things where, let's say you actually have the sound start off round and dull, but swell as it releases. Maybe you have like a very present kick, and maybe you're gonna have to sidechain the 808 a little more, but you still want some of that grittiness to come through. Maybe you'll have the sidechain, the release increase portion. You could also try different shapes too. And again, that's really all just to taste. For what I'm looking for, I just want a smoother but grittier sound. So I'm not looking for that. You can also try different types of distortion. Downsample, and some of them are going to yield very crazy results that kind of take us away. But the tube, I think, is my favorite. So you're getting that little bit of an analog feel to it instead of, just distorting it. From this point, I would say really all you need to finish the sound is a little bit of compression. And play with the settings, the taste as well, if you want more of that transient to come through, a slower attack. But if you want to compress that transient as well, a quicker attack and release is the longer the release, obviously the slower will jump back to no compression, and the quicker you can actually start to create some distortion sounds. You can also try a multi-band compression. But it might bring out too much of the highs. Again, you can play with settings and filters, but we'll stick with just a normal. And from this point, I mean, you got the basics. Really just to taste. Now, what we can do is also maybe create a lot of distortion and then use a filter to bring some of that back. Now, I'm using the second filter within Serum, but this can also easily be achieved by using a filter, your favorite filter externally, synth. And again, you can even set envelopes, shape the sound over time. But it really just depends on what you're looking for. So all these settings you can play with, again, to taste. So your envelope for volume over time you can play with. Your envelope for pitch over time you can play with. You can play with the distortion levels, compressor, the filter, all these things. But if we go back and maybe start with a different waveform. So let's go basic shapes. Square wave. That's super buzzy, right? Maybe too buzzy. Too in our face. Maybe the drive's too much. But because of the square wave itself, never going to get rid of that unless we use filters. So using filters, I find a lot of producers do is where they start with a very harmonically rich sound, and then they use filters to bring that down. And you can even have some kind of modulation on that as well. Already we got a vastly different sound than we have none of the processing on. This is just the original waveform with some filtering on it. And we already have a much more punchy and kind of, it has more character than it would just the sine wave. Right, so we get that nice character before we add any processing. Because the distortion, I find, does add a vocally sound. Like even if we start using, let's say, the saturator in Ableton. You turn on DC, which I prefer. It gives you a really nice like hollow, boxy, vocally sound. But again, how you distort it and whatnot really is up to you. If you have like nice distortion, Now, you know, do I like that? No, but just to show you options, there's really no limitation to what you do to process these to get them to be. Just for sure, always make sure you have some kind of compression, whether it's multi-band, whether it's normal, just to make it punchier, just to give it more of a. And again, we can start to filter it more if we want really round sound. But we still get that grit. Like if we just quickly change this back to the analog, or sorry, to the sine wave. See how round that is, right? It doesn't have a lot of grit, but when you start playing around with what you're using, you can get some really cool sounds. Some of them, you know, aren't going to work for that 808 sound, but like that's really nice, right? Want too many upper harmonic. But you get that it gives you a little more character than just the sine wave. So at the end of the day, 808s, you really just have to follow two things, right? And that's how the volume changes over time and how the pitch changes over time. And once you have those fundamentals down of having a sound that's like a ring, like you want the 808 to act like you're hitting a bell or you're hitting a kick, right? Where you hit it and it rings out on its own. And if you want to stop it, you have to physically stop it. So that's that whole idea of just tapping and it continues to go. And one thing you can even do too then is automate the release, maybe set it to a macro if your synth allows for that. And you can use your macro to increase. You know, if you need to have quick succession of hits, like you can use a macro or even just automate the release so that you can have full control over it, how it rings out. Another way too is obviously bouncing this and then bringing it into a sampler, which I probably would recommend because that gives you that, especially when you pitch up and down, it kind of gives you that feeling of a sample being pitched up and down, which, you know, changes the harmonics differently than they would be within the synth itself. But yeah, that's the basics of how to make your own 808s. Play around with them, experiment, trial and error. Just remember the basics, which are volume over time, like a bell or like a kick, some kind of pitch envelope. However your synth can do it, you want to pitch up from around an octave to 2 octaves back down to your original pitch within, you know, again, to taste, but anywhere within from like 50 milliseconds to 300, depending on the sound. And then always have your mono or polyphony turned on or polyphony turned off, so you don't get. So if we listen, right, see how the releases fall over each other, and it creates that tension or that fluttering. With mono on, it cuts the old note when you play the new note, and every synth can do this. Even if you don't have a mono switch, it's just a matter of setting your polyphony down to one voice. But yeah, remember the basics, and then everything else just have fun with. I hope you enjoy this. If this content is helping you out, please like and subscribe. It helps more than you know. I'll catch you guys on the next one.